She held her baby so tight, his little fists curled against her collarbone, and when the auctioneer called out the next lot number, her lot number, Clara Whitmore did not scream. She had already used up every scream she had. She just pressed her lips to Eli's forehead, closed her eyes for one breath, and made him the only promise she had left to give. Whatever happens to me, I will not let go of you. If this story moves your heart, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Every comment means the world to us. Now let's begin. The trading post smelled of pine sap, tobacco, and old, the kind of fear that soaks into floorboards after enough desperate people have stood on them. Clara had noticed the smell the moment the sheriff's deputy dragged her through the door that morning, her son bundled against her chest, her feet still wet from crossing the frozen creek outside town. She had not been offered dry boots. She had not been offered anything except a number, written in grease pencil on a scrap of paper and pinned to the front of her coat like she was inventory. Because that was exactly what she was to them, Lot 17. One widow, one infant. Outstanding debt of $460, per the estate of Thomas Whitmore, deceased. November 1874. Harlan County, Montana Territory. Thomas had been dead 6 weeks. 6 weeks, and already his creditors had found a way to make his death cost her more than his life ever had. She stood at the back of the room while the men at the front haggled over a mule. Then a handplow, then 2 barrels of salted pork. Clara watched them with the particular stillness of a woman who has already survived the worst she could imagine, and is now simply waiting to find out if she was wrong about what the worst looked like. Eli stirred against her chest. He was 6 months old, and he did not understand auctions or debt or the smell of old fear in a trading post. He only understood that his mother was holding him too tight, and he made a small sound of complaint against her collarbone. Clara whispered, "Shh, baby, I've got you." She did not know if that was still true. That was the part that was killing her. She had married Thomas Whitmore at 17 because her father told her to, and because Thomas had seemed, in those first months, like a man who might turn out decent. He had not turned out decent. He had turned out to be a man with a gambling sickness and a talent for borrowing money he had no intention of repaying, and when the fever took him in early November, it had taken him fast enough that he never had the chance or the inclination, Clara suspected, to warn her about the debts. She had found out the way she found out everything in that marriage too late, after the damage was already done. The estate hearing had lasted 20 minutes. The judge had not looked at her once. The deputy had handed her the eviction notice on a Tuesday. By Wednesday she was standing in this room. Lot 14, the auctioneer called out, and Clara's eyes snapped to the front. She counted the lots. She had 3 more to go. The man standing nearest to her, stocky, with a beard that hadn't been trimmed since summer, looked her over with the flat, assessing gaze of a man pricing cattle. "You nurse the baby yourself?" he asked. Clara turned her face away from him and did not answer. "I'm asking because if you do, that's labor value," he said, like he was explaining something reasonable. "A nursing woman saves on cow's milk. That's worth calculating." The bile that rose in Clara's throat was sharp and specific. She swallowed it. She had learned a long time ago that swallowing was sometimes the only power she had. "Don't touch my son," she said quietly. The man blinked. Something about the flatness of her voice made him step back half a step. He'd been expecting tears, she realized. They always expected tears. Tears made them feel like they were in charge of something. Clara was done giving men that particular satisfaction. She looked down at Eli instead. He had her coloring the brown hair, the pale skin that went pink at the cold, but his eyes were darker than hers, the deep, uncertain gray of a winter sky before it decided what it wanted to do. He was looking up at her with total trust, the way babies do before the world teaches them that trust is a risk. She was going to keep him as long as she could. She was going to fight every single thing that tried to take him. She just did not know yet what fighting looked like in a room like this. Lot 15, the auctioneer called. 2 more. The door to the trading post opened, bringing in a gust of December cold and a scatter of snow that melted almost immediately in the heat of too many bodies. Nobody turned to look. The buyer who had just acquired Lot 15, a buckboard wagon with a broken axle, was arguing over terms, and that argument had everyone's attention. Clara turned. She didn't know why she turned. Some instinct, maybe, the same one that tells you when weather is changing before you can see the sky. The man who had come in through the door was enormous. Not tall in the ordinary way, though he was that too tall enough that he had to angle his head slightly to clear the top of the door frame. But it was the breadth of him that registered first, the sheer volume of presence, like a mountain had decided to put on a coat and walk inside. He wore heavy furs over flannel, trail-worn and functional, and his boots were the kind that meant serious miles in serious country. His beard was dark and thick, shot through at the jaw with threads of iron gray that matched the color of his eyes, and those eyes moved across the room with the slow, steady scan of a man who makes his living reading terrain. Clara had never seen him before. He looked at the auctioneer. He looked at the lot sheet tacked to the wall. He looked at the men near the front, and something shifted in his expression, not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet recognition, like a man seeing a thing he had hoped to find was not true and finding it anyway. Then he looked at Clara. His gaze settled on her for no more than 2 seconds before it moved on. But in those 2 seconds she felt assessed, and then there was no other word for it seen. Not the way the stocky man had looked at her, calculating labor value. Something else, something she didn't have a name for, because it had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way. He moved to the far side of the room and stood there with his arms crossed and said nothing. Lot 16, the auctioneer called. One more. Clara's heart was beating in her ears. She pressed her palm flat against Eli's back and felt his small heartbeat against hers and focused on keeping her breathing even. She had decided, somewhere in the sleepless stretch of the night before, that she was not going to beg. Whatever came next, she was not going to beg these men for anything. It was the last decision she had the power to make, and she was keeping it. The man who purchased Lot 16, a 6-month-old dairy cow, paid quickly and efficiently, and looked satisfied with himself. Clara watched him sign the papers, Lot 17. The room shifted. The energy changed the way it changes when people know something interesting is about to happen. Several men who had been examining the goods tables drifted toward the center of the room. The stocky man near Clara straightened up and pulled at his coat. The auctioneer, a thin man with the nervous manner of someone who knows what he's doing, is ugly, but has decided money makes it acceptable, unfolded his paper and cleared his throat. Lot 17 represents the settlement of debt against the estate of Thomas Whitmore, deceased. The lot includes indenture of service, 1 adult female, 22 years of age, in good health, and 1 male infant, 6 months. Term of indenture to be negotiated with purchasing party. Opening bid is $100. Clara did not look at the floor. She kept her chin level and her eyes straight ahead, and she held her son and she breathed. 120, the stocky man said immediately. 150, said a voice from the left, a heavy-set rancher type Clara had noticed earlier, with the ruddy complexion of a man who drank his way through hard winters. 175, the stocky man said. 200. The bidding moved faster than the livestock had. Clara understood why. A mule could only do one kind of work. The men in this room were calculating all the kinds of work she could do, and they were each arriving at different numbers depending on which kinds they wanted most. She thought about Thomas. Not with grief, she had grieved what Thomas could have been long before he died. She thought about him with a kind of exhausted fury, the fury of a woman whose life has been made into a math problem by men who will never have to solve it themselves. You did this, she thought. You built this particular disaster, and then you left me standing in it. 250, the heavy-set rancher said. 260, said a new voice from the back corner. Clara glanced over. A younger man, lean and sharp-featured, with the calculating look of someone who thinks in numbers. He had not spoken before. He'd been watching and waiting to see where the price settled. 275, the stocky man said, but his voice had gone a little flat. He was approaching his ceiling. Clara could hear it. The room paused. 300, the sharp-featured young man said. The stocky man exhaled through his nose. He said nothing. He was out. 300 going once, the auctioneer said. 300 going. The heavy thud of something hitting the wooden table cut through the room like a pistol shot. Everyone turned. The mountain man had moved from the far wall without anyone noticing him cross the room, and now he stood at the auctioneer's table with his hand flat over a leather pouch that he had dropped from considerable height with considerable force. The pouch was full of something heavy, gold, Clara realized. The sound it made was unmistakable. The mountain man did not look at the auctioneer. He looked at the room. $460, he said. His voice was low, and it carried the way thunder carries. You felt it in your chest before it fully registered in your ears. That's the debt figure on the paper. Full settlement. The auctioneer blinked. The bidding was at 3. I'm not bidding. The mountain man's eyes moved to the auctioneer then, and whatever was in that look made the thin man's nervous energy go very still. I'm settling the debt, in full, right now. That's how debt settlement works. You don't need an auction for that. A murmur went through the room. The sharp-featured young man at the back said, That's not how this works. The process, the mountain man said, without raising his voice, is a legal mechanism for satisfying a debt obligation. The debt is $460. I'm handing you $460. The obligation is satisfied. He looked at the auctioneer again. Is there a reason you can't do arithmetic? The auctioneer looked at the pouch. He looked at the room. He looked at the sharp-featured young man in the back, who was frowning but saying nothing more, because he was the kind of man who only pushed when he was certain he had the advantage. And the mountain man had just shifted the terrain in a way that made certainty hard to locate. I'll need to verify the count, the auctioneer said. Verify it, the mountain man said. He stepped back from the table and crossed his arms again and waited. Clara was staring at him. She knew she was staring. She couldn't stop. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the auctioneer count out the coins with the patient attention of a man who has sat through many long winters and has learned not to waste energy on impatience when waiting will do the same work. The auctioneer counted. He counted again. 460, he confirmed, and his voice was a little thin. Then we're done here, the mountain man said. The indenture papers still need to be. The indenture is void. The mountain man pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and set it on the table beside the pouch. I had my attorney draw that up this morning. Full debt satisfaction terminates any indenture claim under Montana territorial law. You can read it or you can have your own man read it, but the words don't change either way. The auctioneer stared at the paper. The heavy-set rancher in the middle of the room said, Who the devil are you? With the bewildered anger of a man who thought he was going to get what he came for and is now watching it walk away. The mountain man looked at him with no particular expression. Ronan Blackridge, he said. I trap up in the Bitterroots. And I'm not buying a woman. He finally looked at Clara then, directly, and his voice didn't change, but something in his eyes did. I'm taking a family home. The room was very quiet. Clara felt Eli shift against her chest. She felt her own heartbeat, loud and irregular. She felt the weight of every eye in the room, calculating, reassessing, trying to figure out what game this was, because surely there was a game. Surely no man spent $460 in gold on a woman he'd never met without wanting something specific in return. She was thinking the same thing. But she was also thinking about the word he had used. Family. Nobody had called her a family in 6 weeks. 6 weeks of being a liability, a debt, a lot number, a problem to be processed. And this man, this enormous fur-covered stranger, who had walked through a door with a pouch of gold and legal papers, had used that word in front of everyone, without flinching. She didn't trust it. She had learned not to trust things that sounded too good the first time you heard them. But she looked at her son, who was watching Ronan Blackridge with the wide, uncomplicated curiosity of a baby who hasn't learned yet that strangers can be dangerous, and she made the only calculation available to her. The room full of men who had been bidding on her was the devil she knew. This stranger with the gold and the steady eyes was the devil she didn't. And every instinct she had, the ones that had kept her alive through 2 years of a bad marriage and 6 weeks of pure disaster, were telling her that this particular devil was different. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. She only knew that when Ronan Blackridge looked at her, he was not calculating what she could do for him. He was calculating how to get her out of this room. "The papers are in order," the auctioneer said finally, in the voice of a man deciding to let someone else's problem become someone else's problem. "Debt is settled. Transaction is closed." The sharp-featured young man in the back made a sound of disgust and walked out. The heavy-set rancher stared at Ronan for a long moment, then turned and walked to the goods tables like he had somewhere else to be. The stocky man near Clara moved away without looking at her. Ronan walked across the room to where Clara stood. He stopped far enough back to not crowd her, she noticed. Like he understood without being told that she was a woman who had spent the morning being crowded by men and needed the space. "Ma'am," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I'm Ronan Blackridge." "I know that didn't make a lot of sense just now." "You spent $460 on a stranger," Clara said. Her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "That doesn't make any sense at all." A corner of his mouth moved. "Something quieter." "No," he agreed. "Probably doesn't." He looked at Eli, who was looking back at him with total equanimity. "Boy's name?" Ronan nodded slowly, like this was information worth taking seriously. "Good name." He looked up at Clara again. "I have a cabin up in the mountains. It's not much, but it's warm and it's solid, and nobody up there knows your name or your business." He paused. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I know you got no reason to. But I'm asking if you'll come with me, because the alternative is staying in this town, and I don't think this town is done with you yet." Clara looked around the room. The men who hadn't left were still watching them. She could see the calculation still running behind their eyes, the sense that this wasn't finished, that there might still be angles to work. He was right. The town wasn't done with her. She looked back at Ronan. "I have nothing," she said. It was important to her that he understood this. "No goods. Nothing but what I'm wearing and my son." "I know," he said. "I can't pay you back what you spent." "I know that too." "Then what do you want?" She asked it plainly, because she was done with oblique conversations and genteel avoidance of the thing everyone was actually talking about. Ronan was quiet for a moment. When he answered, he looked her in the eyes the whole time, which most men didn't do when they were lying. "Someone to share the work," he said. "Someone who can make a home out of a cabin. Someone who can keep accounts, if you know how I heard you used to manage your husband's books." He paused again. "And Eli needs somewhere safe to grow up, that's what I want. Nothing that ain't freely given." Clara studied him. His face was not a young man's face. There were lines in it from years of weather and solitude, but it was not a hard face in the way that cruelty makes faces hard. It was a face that had seen difficult things and stayed honest about them. She had spent 2 years married to a handsome man with a beautiful face and a mouth full of promises. She had learned to read faces differently now. "I'll come," she said. "But I need you to understand something. Tell me. I am not property. I was lot 17 for about 40 minutes in that room, and that is the last time in my life I will be numbered. If you think that's what you purchased today, you should say so now, while there's still time to correct the misunderstanding." Something changed in Ronan Blackridge's face, not offense. Not anger. Something she could only describe as recognition, like she had said a thing he had been hoping she would say. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "I understand that completely." He held out his arm, not grabbing, not taking, just offering. Clara shifted Eli to her hip, squared her shoulders, and took it. They walked out of the trading post together, into the cold, sharp air of a Montana December, and the men watching them from the window could not tell whether they were seeing the beginning of something or the end of something. Clara was not sure herself, but she was walking out of that room on her own terms, which was more than she had walked in with. Eli made contented sound against her neck. She pressed her cheek to his forehead and walked on. The mountains waited ahead of them, white and enormous and indifferent. The way mountains always are, unmoved by the small human dramas that take place in their shadow, unchanged by anything as temporary as debt or grief or the stubborn, burning need of a woman to survive. But Ronan Blackridge knew those mountains, every ridge and hollow and hidden pass. He moved through them the way a man moves through his own house, without hesitation, without fear. And, somewhere behind his quiet eyes and his measured words, he was doing a different kind of calculation than the men in the trading post had been doing. He was calculating how to keep them safe. He was calculating what it would take to make that cabin feel like something worth coming back to. He was calculating, for the first time in years, for someone other than himself. The horse moved steadily up the trail. Snow fell in small, soft pieces, the kind of snow that accumulates quietly and covers everything that came before. Clara held her son and watched the valley fall away behind them and did not look back. She had made a habit since Thomas died of not looking back. There was nothing behind her she wanted to see again. The mountain ahead of her was cold and foreign and full of uncertainty. But it was forward, and forward right now was everything. The cabin was not what Clara had expected. She didn't know exactly what she had expected, something rougher, maybe something that matched the rawness of everything else that had happened to her in the past 6 weeks. A trapper's cabin in the deep Montana mountains, bought with a man's solitude and years of hard seasons, had no reason to be anything other than brutal and bare. But when Ronan pushed open the heavy door and stepped back to let her through first, Clara walked into a space that was clean. Not elegant, not comfortable in any way she had known comfort before. But deliberate, the kind of clean that comes from a man who lives alone and has made a private decision to not let the wilderness eat him from the inside out. There was a table with 2 chairs, a stone hearth with a fire already laid, needing only a match. A narrow bed against one wall, a rope cot folded in the corner that Ronan had clearly set up that morning before he rode down the mountain. A row of iron hooks by the door holding gear in careful order. Shelves with provisions, dried meat, flour, cornmeal, tins of things she couldn't read the labels on in the dim afternoon light. And on the table a tin cup with a sprig of dried mountain sage in it. Clara stared at that sprig of sage for a long moment. She didn't ask about it. She didn't know how to ask about it without sounding like she was accusing him of something, and she wasn't sure what she would be accusing him of. Trying too hard, hoping for something. Being more human than she'd given him credit for on that ride up the mountain, during which she had studied him sideways the entire time, cataloging every detail. Building the most accurate threat assessment she could manage while also keeping Eli from squirming off her lap. Ronan crossed to the hearth and crouched down and had a fire going in under 2 minutes. "There's water in the barrel by the back wall," he said, without turning around. "I'll melt snow for more in the morning. The cot folds out, it's not much, but it's off the ground and it's warm. I put extra blankets on it. Where will you sleep?" Clara asked. "I've got a bedroll." He stood and brushed ash from his hands. "I'll be fine," she looked at him. "That's your bed." "And that's going to be your cot," he said, with the flat simplicity of someone who has made a decision and does not require agreement, only acknowledgement. "You've got a baby to keep warm. End of discussion." Clara decided not to fight that particular battle tonight. She had a limited supply of fighting energy, and she needed to ration it carefully. She sat down in one of the chairs and settled Eli in her lap, and he immediately grabbed at her braid with both fists, which was his preferred activity when she was holding still. She let him. It was good to have something that normal in her hands. "I need to know the rules," she said. Ronan turned from the fire. "Rules, your rules, for this arrangement, whatever this is." She kept her voice neutral. "I've been in arrangements before where nobody explained the rules until after I broke one. I'd rather know now." He was quiet for a moment. He pulled the other chair out from the table and sat down, not close across from her, giving the table its full width of space between them. He folded his hands on the table and thought about what she'd asked, with the same deliberate attention he seemed to give everything. "I don't have rules," he said finally. "I've habits. I rise before light, I work until dark. I don't drink, you won't find whiskey in this cabin. I don't talk much, but that's habit, not hostility. If I go quiet, it doesn't mean anything's wrong." He paused. "I'll tell you when something's wrong, and for me?" she asked. "What do you expect from me? I told you in town." "Tell me again, specifically." He looked at her steadily. "Someone to manage the provisions and the accounts. I keep a ledger, but I'm not good at it. Numbers aren't my strong suit. Someone to cook when I can't, which is most of the time. Help with the smaller repairs when I'm out on the trap line. Company, I suppose, though I'm aware that's a strange thing to ask for after what today was. He stopped. And I meant what I said, nothing that isn't freely given. If you decide after a week that you can't stay, I'll help you get somewhere safer than where you were this morning. That's not a threat, it's a promise. Eli had successfully unraveled half her braid and was examining the end of it with great scientific interest. Clara watched him for a moment. You knew about me before today, she said. It wasn't a question. You had a lawyer draw up papers this morning. That takes preparation. You knew about the auction before it happened. Ronan didn't flinch. How? I come down to Harlan for supplies about once a month. I heard about the debt settlement proceeding 2 weeks ago. People talk. Something crossed his face, not embarrassment exactly, but a kind of care, the look of a man choosing his words because some words do damage and he'd rather not. I heard about your husband's debts, and I heard what kind of men were planning to bid. Those men, she said carefully. You knew them. I knew their reputations. His voice stayed even, but his jaw tightened slightly. The rancher Hollis Crane, he's had 3 indentured women on his property in 4 years. None of them stayed more than a season. Nobody ever asked too many questions about why they left. He paused. The other one, the younger man who was pushing the bidding up, his name's Decker Foz. He works for a land acquisition company out of Helena. He wasn't interested in you. He was interested in running up the bid to drain whoever won. It's a scheme he's run before. Clara absorbed this. And the man who was standing nearest to me, she said. The one with the beard, Silas Pruitt, a muscle in Ronan's cheek moved. He's a foreman on the Crane Ranch, she understood then. Not every detail, but enough. The stocky man hadn't been there bidding independently. He'd been there to drive the price up for his employer, then drop out, let Crane win at a slightly higher number than he needed to, make the whole thing look like a fair market process. She had been a transaction in a scheme she didn't even fully understand. That was, she realized, almost funny. Almost. You watched all of that from the wall, she said. I did, and you decided to involve yourself, yes. Why? She asked it.
Necessity.
She'd asked him in the trading post flat and direct, because she wanted the truth, and she had learned that dancing around the question just gave people time to compose a better lie. Ronan was quiet again. The fire was going well now, pushing warmth out into the room, and in the better light she could see his picture face more clearly than she'd been able to on the ride up. There was a scar along his left jaw, old and faded, the kind that comes from something that happened a long time ago and has long since become part of the geography of a face. His eyes were gray, the same uncertain gray as Eli's, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing, and still felt like something. I lost someone, he said, long time ago. Not the same way you nearly lost yourself today. Different way. But the end of it looked enough like this morning that he stopped. Seemed to decide something. Continued. I wasn't willing to walk away and let that happen to someone else if I had the means to stop it. Clara waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. That's it? That's it. She believed him. She believed him because men who wanted something from her were usually much more forthcoming with reasons. They wrapped their wanting in elaborate explanations and justifications that were really just persuasion wearing a different coat. Ronan's answer was too sparse to be a sales pitch. It was just a fact, stated by a man who seemed to deal primarily in facts and found anything else faintly exhausting. All right, she said. He blinked. All right. She shifted Eli to her shoulder and stood. Where do you keep the cook pot? The first night in the cabin was not peaceful. Clara didn't expect it to be. She lay on the cot with Eli curled against her side and listened to the sounds of the mountain, the wind against the walls, the settling of timber. The occasional distant cry of something wild and unhappy about the cold, and her mind did what her mind always did when her body was forced to stop. It went back over everything. Thomas's face, the judge who wouldn't look at her. The grease pencil number on her coat, the sound of that pouch hitting the table. Ronan's voice, I'm not buying a woman, I'm taking a family home. She turned the word over again in the dark, family. The presumption of it should have made her angry. They were strangers. They had exchanged maybe 200 words total. Nothing about this was a family, but she couldn't quite reach the anger. She kept getting stuck on the way he had said it, not as a claim, as a declaration to the room full of men who were treating her like a ledger entry. He had said it for them, to make them hear it. She was still thinking about that when Eli startled awake the way babies do, with immediate and total commitment to being awake and unhappy. She sat up and picked him up and rocked him in the dark, shushing softly. And after a few minutes he settled back into sleep with his usual infuriating ease, his little fist knotted in the front of her dress. From across the cabin, in the voice of a man who had clearly also not been sleeping, Ronan said quietly, "He all right?" "He's fine," Clara said. "Babies wake up. It's what they do." Pause. "Does he do it a lot, every 2 to 3 hours?" "Welcome to your new situation." Another pause, and then something happened that Clara did not expect at all. Ronan Blackridge laughed. It was a low sound, rough from disuse, like a door that hasn't been opened in a long time, but it was genuine, and it lasted just long enough to change the quality of the dark in the cabin. "Fair enough," he said. She sat in the dark with her sleeping son and listened to the wind and felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, that she might be able to breathe properly. Not safe. She wasn't going to make the mistake of calling it safe yet. But breathable. That was something. The next morning arrived before it was fully light outside, which turned out to mean Ronan arrived before it was fully light outside, because he had not been lying about his habits. Clara woke to the sound of the fire being built up and lay still for a moment, assessing whether there was any immediate danger, which was what she did every morning now, and then remembered where she was and sat up. Ronan was crouched at the hearth with his back to her, adding wood with the efficient, automatic motions of someone who has performed this action thousands of times. "You don't have to be quiet on my account," Clara said. He glanced back over his shoulder, thought the baby might be sleeping. He is, but he can sleep through noise. He grew up with a man who had loud opinions about things, so he learned early. Ronan's hand stilled for just a half-second on the wood, then continued. "You want coffee? Please." He made coffee with the concentrated attention of a man who takes coffee seriously, and Clara pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat on the edge of the cot and watched him. In the morning light he was still enormous, still occupying more space than most men did, but there was a different quality to him in the cabin than there'd been in the trading post. In the trading post he had been a force of nature walking into a room. In the cabin he was habitual. At home in his movements, the way people are only at home in places they've shaped around themselves over years. He handed her a tin cup and she wrapped both hands around it. "I want to see the ledger," she said. He looked at her. "This morning? Is there a reason to wait?" He thought about this. Then went to the shelf and took down a battered book with a cracked spine and set it on the table. Clara sat down across from it and opened it. She had managed Thomas's accounts for 2 years. Which had been like trying to balance a scale that someone kept adding rocks to in the middle of the night without telling her. She had gotten very good at reading the stories that numbers told when the person writing them didn't want you to understand the plot. Ronan's ledger was different. It was not dishonest. It was simply incomplete. He tracked income and expenditure in a bare, functional way, recording what came in from pelts and what went out for supplies, but with no real system. No way to see trends or project forward. No accounting for depreciation of tools or the actual cost per season of running the trap line. "You're losing money on your north line," she said after about 10 minutes. Ronan lowered his coffee cup. "I'm what the north trap line." "Whatever you're running up there." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed. "Your supply costs for that run are here and here. Your yield from it is here and here. If I'm reading the geography right, and correct me if I'm not, the north line is your longest, which means the most time and the most material. But look at the numbers. What you're bringing back from it barely covers what you're spending to run it." He stared at the ledger. His expression was the particular expression of a man who has suspected something and not wanted to confirm it. "I thought it was a strong line," he said. "Was probably." "When did you last change the placement?" He was quiet. "Ronan, 4 years ago. Then the animals shifted and the line didn't." She pulled the ledger back toward her. "You need to move the north sets. I can figure out the rough cost-benefit if you tell me what you're targeting and what the current yield rate is, but I'd be very surprised if I'm wrong about this." He sat down across from her slowly, like a man recalibrating. He looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize over the following weeks, not quite surprise, because he told her he knew she'd manage the accounts, but something more specific than that. The look of a person discovering that knowing something in the abstract and experiencing it in reality are two substantially different things. "You learned this from managing your husband's business?" he asked. "I learned it because if I didn't know where the money was going, it disappeared and nobody told me why." Necessity is a good teacher. She picked up the coffee cup and met his eyes over the rim. "I'll need a couple of days with this before I can give you anything useful. And I'll need you to answer questions honestly, even when the answers are inconvenient." "I can do that," he said. "Most men say that," Clara said. "Most men mean it until the answer is actually inconvenient." Ronan held her gaze. "I mean it." She held his for a moment longer. Then she nodded and looked back at the ledger. Behind her on the cot, Eli woke up with his usual sudden and absolute commitment to being awake, and the morning began in earnest. The days that followed had a shape that Clara had not expected: useful. She had been afraid, in those first cold hours on the mountain, that she would spend her time here waiting for the trap to close, waiting for Ronan's patience to wear thin, waiting for the other boot to drop. She had spent so much of her life waiting for things to go wrong that she had almost forgotten how to participate in something going right. But Ronan meant what he said about the work. There was relentless, specific, unglamorous work to do, and he expected her to do her share of it without condescension and without ceremony, which turned out to be exactly what she needed. She learned the supplies, what they had, what they'd need before the deep winter closed the trail down entirely, what could be stretched and what couldn't. She rebuilt the ledger from the beginning, organizing it into seasonal columns, adding a projection page that Ronan studied for a long time one evening without saying much, and then said, "Nobody's ever done it this way before," as if that explained something about the world. "It's just arithmetic," Clara said. "It's not just arithmetic," he said. It shows you where you're going before you get there. That's what it's supposed to do." He looked at her projection page again. "I should have done this years ago." "Yes," she agreed. "You should have." And that was the other thing about Ronan Blackridge that Clara was slowly, reluctantly beginning to catalog. He did not need her to soften things. She had spent 2 years with a man who needed her to frame every difficult truth as something other than what it was, who took plain speech as a personal attack, and needed elaborate diplomatic packaging around anything that wasn't praise. She had gotten so good at that packaging that she sometimes couldn't remember what her own unmediated thoughts sounded like. Ronan just absorbed things. He listened. He considered. If he disagreed, he said so directly, and if he agreed, he said so directly, and if he wasn't sure, he said that too. There was a terrible simplicity to it that she found simultaneously disorienting and deeply painfully restful. She told him about the packaging one evening, 3 weeks in, not meaning to. It just came out while they were sitting at the table after dinner, and Eli was asleep, and the fire was low, and the mountain was very quiet outside. She said, "I used to spend so much energy figuring out how to say things that I forgot to actually say them." And Ronan looked up from the piece of harness he was mending and said, "That sounds exhausting." And she laughed, a real laugh. Not the careful social laugh she had been producing for years, and said it was. "It was the most exhausting thing I've ever done." He was quiet for a moment. "Then you don't have to do that here." "I know," she said. And she did know. That was the strange part. She knew it the way she knew things she had figured out by direct evidence rather than by trust, and she had been building the evidence for 3 weeks, brick by patient brick. But it was the 3rd week of December when everything she'd been carefully not trusting got tested in a way she hadn't expected. She had been outside with Eli, wrapped in Ronan's spare coat, a vast, enveloping thing that she had to roll the sleeves up on 4 times, walking the small clear area near the cabin that she had started to think of as the yard. Because Eli needed air and she needed to move, and the cabin was warm but finite. Eli was bundled to the point of immobility and deeply pleased about the snow, which he kept reaching for and then recoiling from with an expression of profound personal betrayal every time his bare fingers touched it. She was watching him do this and laughing quietly, By herself, the way you laugh when no one is watching and you don't have to perform it. When she heard the horse. Not Ronan's horse. Ronan's horse had a particular gait she'd memorized in the first week, the pattern of it distinctive enough that she could tell from inside the cabin when he was coming down the ridge. This was different. This was someone else's horse, coming up the trail from below. Her body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with December. She picked Eli up and pressed him against her shoulder and stood very still and listened, and in another minute the horse came into view, and on it was a man she recognized. Silas Pruitt, the stocky man from the trading post. Hollis Crane's foreman. He pulled up about 20 feet from her and looked her over with the same flat, assessing gaze as before. He was wearing a heavy coat and a wool hat pulled low, and he had the manner of a man who expects to get what he came for. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. Easy, like they knew each other. Claire said nothing. "Mr. Crane sent me up to check on how you're settling in," Pruitt said. "He's been real concerned. Says he feels bad about how the whole situation played out. He'd like to offer you a better arrangement. Better than what you've got here, better accommodations, better terms." "I have a contract," Clara said. Her voice was flat. Pruitt smiled. It did not reach his eyes. "Well now, that's what we need to talk about, ma'am. Because there's some question about whether Mr. Blackridge's debt settlement was fully legal. See, the indenture had already been opened as an auction proceeding, and under territorial law, once a proceeding is opened, the legal mechanism requires it to be closed by auction, not by private settlement. Mr. Crane's lawyer has reviewed the statutes and he believes—" "He's wrong," Clara said. Pruitt blinked. "Montana Territorial Code, Section 42, Paragraph 8, Clara said. She had read every document Ronan's lawyer had drawn up, twice, because she had decided on her first day in the cabin that she was going to understand exactly what her legal position was. A private debt settlement executed by a qualified party before the auction gavel falls closes the proceeding regardless of format. The gavel had not fallen. The debt was settled in full. The indenture is void. She shifted Eli on her hip. "You can tell Mr. Crane's lawyer I said so, and I'd be happy to discuss it further if he wants to put his argument in writing." Pruitt stared at her. The easy manner was gone. What was underneath it was harder and flatter and considerably less friendly. "Mr. Crane is a patient man," he said, "but he doesn't like being told no." "That's a personal difficulty for Mr. Crane," Clara said. "He should work on it." The sound that came from behind her was quiet, but Pruitt heard it. Clara heard it too. She did not turn around, because she already knew what it was. Ronan had come home early. He walked past her, not in front of her, not pushing her aside, but alongside her, stopping just slightly forward, the particular geometry of someone standing with rather than in place of. Clara felt the shift in the air when Pruitt's eyes moved from her to Ronan, the reassessment happening in real time. "Blackridge," Pruitt said. The easy tone made a brief, unconvincing attempt to return. Ronan's voice was completely even. "You're on my land." "Just having a conversation with my wife," Ronan said. Clara went absolutely still. Pruitt went still too, but for different reasons. He was recalculating all the angles, all the implications of that word in that sentence. A conversation with a woman under an indenture arrangement was one thing. A conversation with a married woman on her husband's private land, in a territory where that husband was Ronan Blackridge, was a substantially different thing. "That's news," Pruitt said carefully. "It's recent," Ronan said with the absolute calm of a man who has decided on a course of action and has no doubts about it. "Now I'm going to ask you one time to turn that horse around and ride back down the mountain, and I'm going to suggest you tell Mr. Crane that this conversation happened and that the matter is closed." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. She met his gaze and did not move. He turned the horse around. They watched him ride down the trail until he disappeared into the tree line, and then for another full minute after that, because Ronan seemed to want to be certain before he moved. Then he turned to Clara. She turned to him at the same moment, and they were facing each other in the cold, with Eli making a small, oblivious sound between them. And Clara's heart was going very fast, and it was not entirely because of Silas Pruitt. "My wife," she said. "No," he said. "I apologize. I should have asked you first. I didn't have time." No, she agreed. She looked at him. Is that an option you're actually offering, or was it strategy? Ronan was quiet for a moment, his breath made a cloud in the cold air. He looked at Eli, who had decided the conversation was boring, and was attempting to eat the button on Clara's coat collar. Both, he said finally, honestly. Clara looked at him for a long time. She thought about the ledger and the coffee and the bedroll on the floor, and the sprig of sage in the tin cup that she had decided, somewhere in the second week. To stop pretending wasn't a kind gesture from a man who didn't quite know how to make kind gestures in ways that were visible enough to require him to defend them. That's an honest answer, she said. I try, he said. She turned and walked back toward the cabin. Because Eli was getting cold, and because she needed a few minutes where she was not standing in front of Rome Blackridge, trying to sort out the difference between what she thought she was feeling and what she was actually feeling. He said. She stopped. Looked back. If Crane sends anyone else, he said, I need you to know I will handle it. But I also need you to know that what you just did with Pruitt, the statute, the argument, that was better than anything I could have done. You didn't need me there. No, she said. But it was good that you were. She went inside. Ronan stood in the cold for another moment, looking at the tree line where Pruitt had disappeared, and something settled in his chest that had not been settled in a very long time. In the days following Pruitt's visit, the cabin changed again, not in any visible way. Not in the arrangement of furniture or the pattern of the work. But in the way two people change when they have been forced to show each other something true under pressure. And neither of them has flinched. Clara stopped waiting for the trap. She hadn't been doing it consciously. But she realized, now that she'd stopped, that for 3 weeks she had been holding some portion of her A10 in permanent reserve, watching the edges for movement. Waiting for the thing that would reveal this whole arrangement as something different from what it appeared to be. She'd been doing it so long she hadn't noticed it as extra weight. The weight lifted, not all of it, not enough that she would have called it gone. But enough that she could feel the difference. She started teaching Eli to stand in earnest, holding him by his hands, and letting him practice the stubborn, wobbling effort of making his legs do what legs were meant to do. He was tremendously serious about it, the way babies are serious about physical challenges, applying total concentration to each attempt. She narrated each try for him in her best encouraging voice, and he listened to her with great interest and then fell down anyway and seemed genuinely surprised every time, as if this time would surely be different. Ronan came in one evening to find them in the middle of this enterprise and stopped in the doorway. He's trying to stand, Clara said without looking up. Ronan set down the wood he'd been carrying. He crossed the room and crouched down on the other side of Eli, his big hands ready, and said, Here, boy. Try again. Eli looked at him with enormous seriousness. Then he grabbed Ronan's index finger with both his fists and hauled himself upright. And stood there, swaying dramatically, holding on, looking around the room from his new altitude, with the expression of a man who has just reached a summit and wants everyone to acknowledge the achievement. There you go, Ronan said very quietly. There you go, Eli. Clara watched Ronan's face. The way it opened, the way the habitual gravity of it shifted into something younger and softer and wholly unguarded, lasted only a few seconds before he seemed to remember himself. But she had seen it. She had filed it carefully. The way she filed the sage in the tin cup and the bedroll on the floor and the explanation of Hollis Crane's reputation and the word both said honestly in the cold. She was building a case. She was not sure yet what verdict it was leading her toward. But the evidence was considerable, and she had always been very good at evidence. The weeks turned, and the mountain held them in its vast, indifferent embrace, and the cold deepened, and the fire in the cabin burned steady through it all, and the ledger grew organized and accurate. And Eli learned to stand, and then on a Tuesday evening in early January, when Ronan was sitting at the table and Clara was across from him and they were not talking, just occupying the same warm space with the particular ease of people who have learned each other's silences, Eli let go of the table edge and took 3 steps. 3 complete, unsupported, magnificent steps, then sat down on the floor with a thump, looked up at both of them, and broke into the broadest, most self-satisfied grin that had ever appeared on a human face. Ronan made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, a sound Clara would think about later, in the long quiet of a night when sleep didn't come easily, and understand that it was the sound of a man who has not been surprised by joy in a very long time and is being surprised by it now. "Did you see that?" she said, and realized her voice was shaking slightly. "I saw it," Ronan said. He was still looking at Eli with that unguarded expression. "I saw it, and Clara thought something is happening here. Something that was not in either of their plans and was not safe and was not simple and was going to require her to make a decision at some point. A real decision, the kind that couldn't be made by evidence and arithmetic alone. She was not ready to make it yet, but she was no longer afraid of it. That was new. That was the newest thing of all. In the whole accumulation of new things this mountain had given her security, usefulness, the slow reclamation of her own competence, the daily evidence of a man who meant what he said. This was the one that had arrived most quietly and settled most deeply. She was no longer afraid. Not of this man. Not of whatever was building between them, carefully and without rush, like a fire laid with attention and lit only when the wood was ready. She did not know what it was going to become. She only knew that for the first time since she stood on a trading post floor, with a number pinned to her coat, the future looked like something she wanted to move toward, rather than something she needed to survive. Outside the cabin, the Montana winter pressed down white and absolute. Inside, the fire burned, and Eli sat on the floor looking proud of himself. And two people who had both given up on certain things sat across from each other in the warm and said nothing and meant more by it than most people manage with words. January in the Bitterroots had a particular kind of silence that Clara had not encountered anywhere else in her life. It was not the silence of an empty room or the silence of a sleeping house. It was the silence of something enormous, holding its breath, the mountains, the snow, the whole frozen architecture of the wilderness, pressing down in a way that made the walls of the cabin feel both fragile and precious at the same time. She had stopped being afraid of that silence somewhere around the second week of the new year. What she had not stopped being was watchful. Watchfulness was not the same as fear, she had decided. Fear was reactive, it happened to you. It hijacked your body and scrambled your thinking. Watchfulness was active. It was a choice. It was the thing that had kept her alive through 2 years of a marriage that turned dangerous in small increments, through 6 weeks of dissolution and legal erasure, through that morning in the trading post when her whole future had been reduced to a lot number and a grease pencil mark. She was going to keep being watchful. She had just stopped pointing that watchfulness at Ronan. She was pointing it at other things now. At the way Eli's breathing changed slightly when the temperature dropped fast inside the cabin, so she could add wood before it became a problem. At the ledger projections she updated every Sunday, watching the numbers for any sign that their supply calculations were off. At the particular quality of Ronan's silences, which she had catalogued enough by now to distinguish between the silence of a man thinking through a problem and the silence of a man carrying something he hadn't decided to put down yet. He had been carrying something for 3 days. She knew the shape of it, the way you know weather you can't see yet by the pressure of it, the way it changed the texture of ordinary moments. He was eating less. He was spending longer at the trapline and coming back later. He sat at the table in the evenings, with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and looked at a point somewhere past the fire, with the expression of a man doing internal arithmetic on something the numbers weren't coming out right on. She let him carry it for the 3 days because she respected the privacy of his process. Ronan was not a man who needed to be pulled toward his conclusions. He arrived at them on his own schedule and said them when they were ready to be said. But on the 4th morning, when he came back from the trapline 2 hours earlier than usual and sat down at the table without taking off his coat, Clara set down the harness buckle she'd been mending and said, "Tell me." He looked up. "Whatever it is," she said, "tell me." We agreed honest, even when it's inconvenient. He put both palms flat on the table. "Crane is moving," he said. Clara went very still. "Moving how?" "I was up on the North Ridge this morning, the new placement you suggested, the one that's already showing better yield. There's a survey stake at the eastern edge. Fresh, new paint. Somebody drove it in the last week." He met her eyes. The eastern edge of that ridge is inside my boundary. I've got the original land patent from 1869. But somebody put a survey stake on it, which means somebody is claiming the line runs differently than it does. Clara understood what this meant immediately, because she had been managing accounts and documents for long enough to know how land fraud worked. Not the dramatic kind, not somebody riding up with guns and demanding you leave. The slow kind, the paperwork kind, the kind where somebody with a lawyer and a county recorder in their pocket redrew a line on a map and waited to see if you noticed, and if you did notice, waited to see if you could afford to fight it. How much land, she asked, if the stake is where I think it is about 60 acres. Including the North Ridge line, which is your best trap line. Which will be my best trap line, he said, after the adjustments. The one that actually makes the operation profitable. Clara turned this over. Crane, of course it was Crane. Crane had been blocked from getting what he wanted in December, and men like Crane did not accept being blocked. They simply redirected. When did you file the original patent, she asked. 1869. I've got the papers in the box under the bed. Get them. He got up and retrieved a battered tin box from under the bed and set it on the table. Clara opened it. Inside were the land patent papers, the original survey documents, and a collection of other legal papers accumulated over the years, slightly disorganized but intact. She spread the survey documents on the table and oriented herself to the geography. What are the boundary markers, she asked. 3 stone cairns on the east side. I built them myself, and a marked pine on the southern corner, big old ponderosa with an H carved in it from when I filed. H for Harlan County, B for Black Ridge. Are the cairns still standing? He looked at her. Are they? She pressed. I didn't check this morning. I saw the stake and came back. We need to check the cairns, Clara said. If Crane is running a boundary fraud, the first step is usually to obscure or remove the existing markers. If your cairns are intact and the marked pine is intact, you have physical evidence that supports the original survey. If they've been disturbed, reorganized. Either way, we need to know before we do anything else. Because what we do next depends on what the physical evidence shows. Ronan was watching her with that expression again, not surprise exactly, more like a man watching a door open on a room he knew existed, but hadn't been in before. You've seen this before, he said. Thomas has borrowed money from men like Crane, Clara said. Her voice was even. When he couldn't pay, they found creative ways to collect. I watched them do it. I learned what to look for. She looked back at the survey documents. This is not a coincidence, and it is not random. Crane sent Pruitt up here in December and we turned him away. Now he's coming at the land. He's escalating, Ronan said. He can find land closer to his own operation without the elevation problems. Why does he want 60 acres in the Bitterroots? Because it's not about the land, Clara said. Ronan waited. It's about you, she said. You humiliated him. In front of witnesses. A man like Crane doesn't carry that quietly. He needs to win something back, and winning the land is how he makes the point that you can't stop him. She folded the survey map carefully and put it back in the box. He's going to keep coming until you stop him completely, or until he breaks you down enough to take what he wants. The silence that followed had a different quality than Ronan's thinking silences. This one had weight in it. Then we stop him completely, Ronan said. Yes, Clara said, we do. The next morning, they rode out together to the North Ridge. It was the first time Clara had been that far out from the cabin, and the cold at elevation was a different animal than the cold in the valley, drier, and sharper and brutally honest about where it stood. Ronan had bundled Eli against her chest under the outer coat, so the baby's heat and hers could share the same space, and Eli had been deeply offended by this arrangement for the first 10 minutes, and then fallen asleep, which was his position on most things he couldn't immediately change. The survey stake was exactly where Ronan had described it, fresh-driven, bright orange paint on new wood, precisely the kind of marker a county surveyor would use. Clara crouched down and looked at it without touching it. It's not a county marker, she said. How can you tell? County markers have a registration stamp on the side, a stamped metal plate with the date and the recorder's office number. This one doesn't. She stood and brushed snow off her knees. This is a private marker. Someone put it here to make it look official. If you weren't paying attention, or if you didn't know what a real county marker looks like, you'd assume the county had redrawn the line. Ronan looked at the stake with an expression that was making its way steadily from controlled toward something that needed to stay controlled. "Can you photograph it somehow?" Clara said. "No, I know, we don't have the equipment. But we can document it. Do you have paper in the saddlebag?" He did. She wrote a description of the stake, its position relative to the terrain features she could identify, and a clear note that it bore no county registration stamp. She had Ronan sign it. She dated it. "Now show me the cairns," she said. 2 of the 3 cairns were intact. The third one, the northeastern corner, closest to where the false stake had been planted, had been knocked down. The stones were scattered in a pattern that was not the pattern of weather or animal or normal erosion. They had been pushed. Clara stood looking at the scattered stones with a fury so clean and specific it almost felt like clarity. "He sent someone up here," Ronan said, and his voice had gone to a place she hadn't heard it go before, a low, careful flatness that was nothing like his ordinary quiet. It was the flatness of a man restraining himself with great deliberate effort. "He sent someone up here while we were in the cabin," Clara said. "Within the last week, which means after Pruitt came and reported back." She looked at Ronan. "He knows where our boundaries are, and he moved on the weakest corner the moment he had a reason to." "I need to go see Crane," Ronan said. "No," Clara said immediately. He looked at her. "That's what he wants," she said. "He wants you angry and coming at him directly, because that's a fight he knows how to win. He has money and a lawyer and a county recorder he's probably already paid, and if you ride up to his gate in a fury, you are handing him exactly the narrative he needs: dangerous mountain man, threatening a respectable landowner. He'll have you arrested, and the land question gets buried under the criminal matter." She shook her head. "We don't go to him, we go to the law before he does." Ronan was still restraining himself. She could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders, in the particular quality of stillness he had that meant motion was being suppressed rather than absent. "The law in Harlan County," he said carefully, "may already be in Crane's pocket." "Harlan County law maybe," Clara said, "which is why we don't go to Harlan County." She met his eyes. "We write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Directly. With the original patent documents, the survey evidence, the documentation of the false stake, and a description of the removed cairn. The Territorial Office operates above the county level. Crane doesn't own Helena." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "Then how do you know how to do all of this?" Clara looked back at the scattered cairn stones. "Because Thomas's creditors tried to take our house the same way," she said. "They didn't succeed because I found the original deed and walked into the county recorder's office myself and made them explain every discrepancy in writing." She bent and picked up one of the cairn stones and set it back where it belonged. "They did not expect that. Men like Crane never expect women to know the paperwork." She picked up another stone. After a moment, Ronan crouched down beside her and began rebuilding the cairn. They worked in silence, fitting the stones back together, and when it was done, Ronan stood and looked at it and then looked at Clara. "All right," he said, "we write to Helena." "Today," she said. "We write today." The letter took 3 hours. Clara drafted it 4 times before she was satisfied precise, being inflammatory, thorough, without being so lengthy that a bureaucrat would put it at the bottom of a pile. She cited the specific patent number, the specific survey documents, the territorial land code sections that governed boundary markers, and described the false stake in language that made clear she knew the difference between official and unofficial markers. She described the disturbed cairn. She requested formally an inspection by a territorial land surveyor. Ronan read each draft and made 2 corrections in the final version, a date she had off by 1 year, and a description of the eastern boundary that needed to reference a creek name he knew, and she didn't. Other than that, he let her work and did not try to improve on what she was doing. When she was finished, he looked at her over the completed letter and said, "You're good at this." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. "Is it a problem that I find that reassuring rather than threatening?" "No," she said. "It means you're smarter than most men I've known." He did smile then, briefly, the reluctant one she was learning to read. "I'll take that." He rode down to town the next morning to post the letter, and Clara spent the day with Eli in the ledger and a sharply heightened awareness of every sound that came from outside the cabin. Pruitt had come once. Crane's man had been up to the North Ridge in the dead of winter to move rocks. These were not the actions of a man who was going to be discouraged by a letter to Helena. She was not going to pretend otherwise. She went to the shelf where Ronan kept his rifles, took down the smaller of the two, a Winchester that she had been watching him handle for weeks, cataloging the mechanism without drawing attention to it, and she sat down with it on the table and familiarized herself with it carefully and completely. She was not going to be in the cabin waiting when the next thing came. She was going to be ready. Ronan came back from town in the early afternoon and walked in to find her at the table with the rifle broken down in front of her, each component laid out in the order she had disassembled them. He stopped. He looked at the rifle parts. He looked at her. "I should have shown you how to do that weeks ago," he said. "I figured it out," she said. "I can see that." He took off his coat and hung it. "Safety's a little stiff. You have to push it hard to the right, not just nudge it." I noticed. She began reassembling the rifle in the reverse order. "Did the letter go out?" "On the noon stage to Helena." He sat down across from her and watched her work. "There's other news." Something in his tone made her hands pause. "Tell me," she said. "I stopped at the land office in town while I was there," he said. "Wanted to check if there'd been any recent survey requests filed on the eastern boundary." "Had there? There had." His voice was very even. "Filed 3 days ago. By a company called Bitterroot Land and Mining. Survey request for the entire eastern edge of my patent, citing a claim that my original filing contained an error in the boundary description." Clara set down the reassembled rifle very carefully. "Bitterroot Land and Mining?" I asked around. Ronan folded his hands on the table. Nobody in town had heard of the company, so I asked the land clerk who filed the request in person. He described a lawyer well-dressed, came from Helena, had all his papers in order. Paid the filing fee in cash. Ronan paused. The clerk also mentioned that a man fitting Hollis Crane's description had been in the office the day before. The picture assembled itself in Clara's mind with cold, specific clarity. Crane hadn't just put a fake stake in the ground. He'd filed a formal legal challenge through a company that existed on paper for exactly this kind of purpose, a shell, a legal fiction with a name that sounded like a real operation. He'd done it in advance, before Pruitt's visit, before the North Ridge survey stake. The whole thing had been prepared and waiting. This was not opportunistic. This had been planned. "He started this before we turned Pruitt away," she said slowly. "Yes," Ronan said. "He came to Harlan County in December for the auction, knowing he might not win the bid," she said. "And he had this ready in case he didn't. The land was always the actual target." "You were always the actual target." Ronan said nothing. "Why?" Clara said. "You specifically." Ronan was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she understood this was one of the things he had been carrying, that he hadn't decided whether to put down yet. "Ronan," she said. "My land," he said finally, "sits between Crane's eastern holdings and a section of federal land that the government has been quietly reassessing for railroad access. If the transcontinental expansion comes through the northern route, which the surveyors were talking about last fall, the access corridor goes through my patent. My 60 acres is the gap in Crane's puzzle. Without it, he can't assemble the parcel he needs to sell the right-of-way to the railroad at the price he wants." Clara stared at him. "That's," she started, stopped. "A lot of money," Ronan said. "You've known this." "I've suspected it. Since last fall when the surveyor talk started." He looked at his hands. I didn't think he'd move this fast, and I didn't know about the shell company." "You should have told me," Clara said. "I know, Ronan." She waited until he looked up. "We agreed honest even when it's inconvenient. This is considerably more inconvenient than a misplaced survey line. This is a man with railroad money on the table who wants your land badly enough to have spent months preparing a legal strategy to take it." "You're right," he said. Flat, direct. "No defense," she breathed. "Let Thanker and Winket pass through the room and leave without making a speech." "All right," she said. "Then we adjust how. The letter to Helena is still correct, but it's not enough by itself. We need to identify who Bitterroot Land and Mining actually is, who filed the incorporation papers, who the principals are. That information is public record. It's in the Territorial Business Registry. She was thinking out loud now the way she thought when the numbers were complex and she needed to hear them spoken. If we can show that Bitterroot land and mining is a legal fiction created specifically by Crane or his associates, the land challenge falls apart. You can't use a shell company to file a boundary dispute against a valid patent. There's no standing. But we have to prove the connection. How? I need to go to Helena, she said. The silence that dropped into the room was very specific. No, Ronan said, I need access to the business registry. It's a public record, but it has to be examined in person, minds. No, he said again, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger, something more like controlled fear, Clara. Crane knows who you are. If he has people watching the roads, and I have to assume he does, because everything about this says he's been thorough. Then you come with me. Someone needs to be on the land. Someone needs to go to Helena. She kept her voice even, because this was a real disagreement, not a performance of one, and it needed to be treated like what it was. Ronan, I am not a woman you need to keep inside a cabin while you handle things. You know that. You've known it since the first morning I showed you what your ledger was actually telling you. He looked at her. His jaw was working slightly, the way it did when he was fighting his own instincts. I'm not saying you can't go, he said carefully. I'm saying I'm afraid of what happens if Crane's people recognize you on the road and decide the cleanest way to resolve this situation is to make sure you can't testify to anything. The flatness of it, the way he said it without softening, landed differently than she expected. He was not trying to control her. He was telling her something he was afraid of. She had not been afraid of her own safety since December, because the cabin had made her feel contained, bounded. The road was different. Then we solve the road problem, she said. We don't solve it by not going. They argued it for another hour, circling through logistics and risks and the genuine competing weights of leaving the land undefended versus leaving the legal situation unanswered. And at the end of the hour they had arrived at a plan that neither of them entirely liked, which Clara had learned was usually the mark of a plan that was actually reasonable. Ronan's neighbor up the North Valley, a trapper named Walt Elkins, who was one of 3 people in the county Roan considered trustworthy, would stay at the cabin with the land. Clara would ride to Helena with Ronan. They would travel as an ordinary married couple with a baby, which was both practical and exactly what Ronan had declared them to be in front of Pruitt, so it required no particular fabrication. They would spend 3 days at the most, access the business registry, document what they found, and bring it back. Agreed, Clara said, Ronan said. And then, because neither of them was the kind of person who left things implied when they could be said plainly, they sat quietly for a moment with the agreement between them. And Eli, who had been examining the hearth bricks with intense concentration throughout the entire conversation, pulled himself upright on the edge of the woodbox and stood there, grinning like he had just heard good news. He knows something we don't, Ronan said. He always does, Clara said. She reached over and moved the woodbox slightly so Eli had more to hold on to, and her hand brushed Ronan's arm, and neither of them moved away from it. They left for Helena 4 days later, after Walt Elkins arrived and Ronan had shown him every detail of the property and the situation with the controlled thoroughness of a man who prepares for bad outcomes even when he's planning for good ones. The road to Helena in January was not a road, it was an argument between human intention and winter geography. It was long and cold, and Eli spent the first 4 hours making his opinion of horses very clear before exhausting himself into sleep. And Clara and Ronan rode mostly in silence, not the loaded silence of tension, but the practical silence of people paying attention to terrain and staying warm. About midway through the second day, Ronan said, "Tell me about before Thomas." Clara looked at him sideways. "You know more about me than I know about you," he said. "And we're going to be in a city for 3 days. It seems reasonable." She thought about it. "My father was a schoolteacher in Wisconsin," she said. "I had 3 brothers. I was the only one who liked books as much as my father did, and he taught me everything he knew, which included accounting because he handled the school district books. When he died, I married Thomas, because Thomas was there, and it seemed like the practical decision." She paused. I was 17 and I was wrong about miss and wrong about the word practical, but those are mistakes you can only understand from the other side of them. How old are you two? Ronan was quiet. And 38, he said. Came west from Pennsylvania at 24. Got the land patent at 25. Been in the mountains ever since. You mentioned someone, Clara said, carefully, when you explained why you came to the auction. You said you lost someone. The silence this time was different, thicker, with something moving underneath it. My wife, he said. Her name was Anna. She died in the winter of '68 before I filed the patent. Fever. There was nothing anyone could have done, and I spent years believing I could have done something anyway. He kept his eyes on the road. After that, I didn't see the point, and he stopped. In bringing anyone else into a situation where I couldn't guarantee their safety. You can't guarantee anyone's safety, Clara said. That's not a thing that's possible. I know that, he said. Now she looked at his profile, the scar along his jaw. The lines from weather and years, and a particular kind of long private grief. I'm sorry about Anna, she said. I'm sorry about Thomas, he said. The version of Thomas you married who turned out not to exist. That was, Clara thought, the most precise description of that grief she had ever heard. The version of Thomas who turned out not to exist. She had grieved that Thomas, the theoretical Thomas, the one she had married for longer and more genuinely than she had grieved the actual man. Yes, she said, that's exactly it. They rode on in the afternoon cold, and something that had been silently accumulating between them for weeks settled into a different configuration, not resolved, not named, but acknowledged. The way you acknowledge weather that's coming, not trying to stop it, just recognizing that it's real. Helena in January was loud and crowded and aggressively alive in the way that territorial capitals were when there was money moving through them. And Clara had grown so accustomed to the mountain's quiet that the noise of it hit her like a physical thing. She adjusted in about 20 minutes the way she adjusted to most things, by observing and categorizing until the unfamiliar became familiar enough to navigate. They found a respectable boarding house, the kind with a landlady who took one look at Eli and decided to be an ally. And on the first morning, Clara went to the Territorial Business Registry while Ronan arranged a meeting with a Helena land attorney he'd been given a name for by Walt Elkins. The registry clerk was a small, efficient man with ink on his fingers who was initially annoyed by her presence in the way that small, efficient men are annoyed by anyone who interrupts the order of their system. He became less annoyed when she told him exactly which records she needed and exactly why, using the correct terminology throughout. Because there is nothing that commands the respect of a system keeper like demonstrating that you understand the system. The incorporation papers for Bitterroot Land and Mining were filed 11 months ago. The principal listed was a man named Gerald Foz. Clara stood very still at the records counter with the paper in front of her. Foz, Decker Foz, the sharp-featured young man at the auction who had been driving up the bid. Gerald Foz. Related father, uncle. The relationship was unclear, but the name was not a coincidence. She asked the clerk for two more things: the business registry entry for any company with principals named Crane or associated with Crane, and the filing history for Bitterroot Land and Mining going back to its incorporation. What she found in the next 40 minutes was worse she had expected, and more complete than she had hoped. Gerald Foss had filed 3 previous land challenges in 2 other counties using the same mechanism: shell company, false survey marker, formal challenge. Then purchase of the targeted land at force sale price when the original owner couldn't sustain the legal fight. The same lawyer had appeared in all 3 cases. The same county-level contacts had processed the paperwork. This was not a scheme invented for Ronan Blackridge. This was a business. She brought the documentation to Ronan at the land attorney's office, 4 pages of handwritten notes, 2 certified copies of relevant records that the clerk had produced for a small fee, and spread it on the attorney's desk. The attorney, a precise man named Howard Garrett, who had the manner of someone who had seen most varieties of frontier legal misconduct and maintained a professional calm about all of them, looked through her notes without speaking for 5 minutes. Then he said, "Where did you get your legal training, Mrs. Blackridge?" "I don't have legal training," Clara said. I have a father who liked books and a hard education in what happens when you don't read documents carefully. Garrett looked at her over the papers, then at Ronan. Your wife just handed you the framework for a federal fraud case, he said. What you have here isn't a boundary dispute, it's a pattern of conduct. 3 prior instances. Same mechanism. Same lawyer. Documented paper trail. That's the kind of thing that interests the U.S. Marshal's office. He tapped the papers. This doesn't just defend your land. If you're willing to press it, this brings down the whole operation. Ronan looked at Clara, at him. We press it, she said. We press it, he confirmed. Garrett looked between them with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation. All right, he said. Then let's talk about how we do this properly. They were in Garrett's office for 3 hours. When they came out, the January afternoon had gone gray and the temperature had dropped, and Eli had been asleep against Clara's chest for most of the last hour and had opinions about being awake again. She walked with him in the cold while Ronan settled the initial retainer with Garrett, bouncing slightly to keep the baby content. And she thought about the papers on that desk, and the pattern of conduct and the 3 previous victims who had lost their land to the same mechanism and almost certainly had no idea that what had happened to them had a name and a paper trail. Ronan came out and stood beside her. You know what this means, he said. Crane is going to know we went to Helena, she said. He's going to know what we found. Garrett is going to contact the marshal's office, which means there's a formal proceeding, which means Crane gets notified. She kept bouncing Eli. We probably have a few weeks before he understands the scale of what he's facing. After that, he's going to stop being subtle. Yes, Ronan said. We need to be ready for that. Yes, he said again. She looked at him. Are you worried? He considered the question with his usual deliberate honesty. I'm concerned, he said. Worried implies I think we're going to lose. I don't think we're going to lose. Good, she said. Because neither do I. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked back, and Eli grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled, which broke the moment in the most undignified way possible and somehow made it better. Come on, Ronan said. Let's get him inside before he freezes. They walked back to the boarding house together through the gray January cold, the 3 of them. And above them the territorial capital made its noise and its business and paid them no attention at all, which was exactly how they wanted it. What was building between them had no name yet. Clara was not ready to name it, and she suspected Ronan wasn't either, and she had learned enough by now to trust that timing mattered, that some things required their full season before they were ready. But she was no longer afraid of where it was going. She was no longer afraid of much at all. That, she thought, pressing her lips to Eli's cold little forehead as they stepped inside out of the wind, was the most radical transformation she had undergone in all of this. Not the legal knowledge or the rifle mechanics or the ledger projections or even the slow, careful reconstruction of her own sense of self. The loss of fear. The replacement of it with something that felt quietly and without announcement, like the beginning of ferocity. She had been a woman waiting for the worst. She was becoming something else entirely. And Hollis Crane, who had spent 11 months building a mechanism to take what he wanted from people who didn't know how to fight back, had no idea what was coming home from Helena. They rode back from Helena in 2 days instead of 3. It was Ronan's decision. Made quietly on the morning of the 2nd day, when he came back from the livery stable, with a look Clara had learned to read the particular compression around his eyes that meant he'd heard something while she hadn't been present to hear it. He didn't make her ask. He told her while he was saddling the horse, his hands moving with the efficient speed of someone who wants to be moving already. Man at the stable was talking to another man about a fire, Ronan said. North of town. Trapper's cabin, he said. Isolated property up in the Bitterroot. Clara's hands went still on the saddlebag buckle. Walt, she said. I don't know. His voice was controlled in the specific way it got when he was controlling it deliberately. It might not be our property, but I'm not staying a 3rd day to find out. She didn't argue. She had Eli bundled and the bags loaded in 20 minutes, and they were on the road before the morning had fully decided what it wanted to be. The ride back was not the same as the ride out. On the ride out there had been tension, but underneath it the tentative quality of something new being navigated. The ride back had a different texture, entirely tighter, faster, the silence between them not companionable but watchful. Clara held Eli and watched the road and ran through scenarios the way she ran through ledger columns, looking for where the numbers went wrong. If Crane knew they'd gone to Helena, and he did know, she had no doubt about that. A man who planned 11 months in advance had people watching roads, then he knew what they'd gone to find. He knew about Garrett. He knew the framework had shifted from a local land dispute to a potential federal fraud case. And a man facing a federal fraud case had a limited window to either destroy evidence or apply enough pressure to make the complainants withdraw. Destruction of evidence, she thought about the cabin. About the tin box under the bed with Ronan's land patent and original survey documents. The documents, she said. Ronan looked at her. If the cabin was targeted, she said it might have been targeted for the documents. Not just to frighten us, she watched him process this. Watched his jaw set. The certified copies are in my coat, he said. The originals are in the cabin. She finished it for him. Which may or may not still be standing. He pushed the horse faster. They came over the last ridge in the early afternoon of the second day, and Clara's chest was so tight she was barely breathing. And then the cabin came into view and it was standing intact. Smoke coming from the chimney. Walt Elkins's horse in the yard, and she exhaled so hard and fast it startled Eli awake. It's fine, she said to Eli and to herself and to the sharp terror that had been sitting in her sternum for 2 days. It's fine. But the look on Walt Elkins's face when he came out the door was not the look of a man whose situation was fine. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with the unhurried manner of someone who had survived enough frontier winters to stop being dramatic about things. When he was dramatic, it meant something. Cabin's fine, he said before they were fully dismounted. But you need to hear what happened. They heard it at the table, Walt with his coffee and his particular economy of words, telling them about the 2 men who had come up the trail on the second night. Not Pruitt. Walt didn't know Pruitt, but 2 men who said they were county surveyors doing a boundary verification and wanted access to the property. Walt had told them the property owner was away, and they could come back when Ronan was home. They said they had a county authorization and didn't need the owner present. What did you do? Ronan asked. Walt looked at him steadily. I told them the boundary between county authorization and trespassing was my rifle, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. Did they leave? They left. Walt paused. But one of them, before they turned around, he looked at the cabin and said something. To the other one, not to me. He said, tell him the surveying can happen easy or hard. Walt picked up his coffee cup. I figured you'd want to know the exact words. Tell him the surveying can happen easy or hard. Clara heard that sentence and felt something shift in her chest. Not fear. The thing that came after fear runs out its useful life and gets replaced by something colder and more permanent. She had been afraid of Crane, in the abstract afraid of what he represented, the kind of power that moved through lawyers and shell companies in county offices. She was no longer afraid of him in the abstract. She was angry at him specifically, at this specific message, at the absolute presumption of a man who thought he could send surrogates up a mountain to deliver threats to someone else's home. Easy or hard, she said. That's what he said, Walt confirmed. All right, she set her hands flat on the table, then we make it hard. Walt looked at her, then at Ronan. Something in his expression shifted toward a kind of approval he hadn't been offering before. I like her, he said to Ronan. When'd you get smart? December, Ronan said. Walt snorted, finished his coffee, and stood. I'll stay another few days if you need me. I need you to do something else, Clara said. Walt looked at her. I need you to go back to Harlan County and find out if those 2 men filed anything at the land office. Any paperwork, any survey record, anything with their names on it. And if they did, I need you to remember those names and bring them back to me. Walt considered this. You looking to connect them to Crane? I'm looking to connect everything to Crane, she said. Individually, the pieces look like coincidence. Together, they look like a pattern. And a pattern is evidence. Walt put on his hat and looked at Ronan. Trading post, Ronan said. She was a lot number. Walt shook his head slowly, the way people do when the world has surprised them in a direction they didn't anticipate. He went out, and they heard his horse on the trail, and then the mountain was quiet again. Ronan sat down across from Clara. Eli was on the floor between them, deeply engaged with a wooden spoon he had acquired at some point during the Helena trip and which had become his most important possession. "They're going to keep coming," Ronan said. "Yes," Clara said. "Garrett is filing the federal petition this week. That gives Crane maybe 2 weeks before the marshal's office contacts him and the legal mechanism starts. 2 weeks where he has every incentive to resolve this outside the legal process. By resolving it, he means making us go away."
Yes.
"He can't make us go away," Clara said. "No," Ronan said. "But he might try something that makes staying very expensive." He looked at her directly. "I need you to hear me on this, Clara. I'm not asking you to be afraid. I'm asking you to let me think through the physical security of this property in a way that chose words. In a way that requires you to tell me if you see or hear anything I haven't seen or heard. Because I know this land, and you know these people better than I do at this point. We need both." She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming in at an angle that caught the gray in his beard, and the older scar along his jaw and the newer tension around his eyes. And she thought about the man who had walked into a trading post in December with a leather pouch of gold and legal papers he'd had prepared in advance, who had carried a bedroll on his own cabin floor for 2 months without complaint, who had said "my wife" in front of a man sent to threaten them and meant something by it that they had both been carefully not examining ever since. "I'll tell you everything I see," she said, "and I expect the same." "You have it. Then we're all right." She said it like a fact, which was how she had learned to say things she needed be true. "We're going to be all right." The first week after Helena passed in the specific tension of people waiting for a storm they can't see yet, but can feel in the pressure of the air. Ronan reinforced the door latch and added a second bar across it. He established a pattern of checking the perimeter of the property each morning. Not obviously, he'd already done this as part of his trapline routine, but more systematically, with attention to signs of human presence. Clara reorganized the documents into 2 separate caches, originals and certified copies kept apart from each other, so that any targeted theft would only get half the record. Garrett wrote on the 9th day. The federal petition had been filed. The U.S. Marshal's office in Helena had received it and assigned it to Deputy Marshal Leonard Cade. Crane would be formally notified within the week. Ronan read the letter twice and handed it to Clara without comment. She read it and felt 2 things simultaneously: relief that the legal machinery was now in motion, and the cold certainty that the legal machinery moving was exactly the thing that would force Crane's hand. "He's going to do something," she said. "Yes," Ronan said. "Before Cade makes contact, he'll want to have already moved." "What does moving look like for a man like Crane?" Ronan was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Clara understood that there were things about Hollis Crane's history that Ronan knew and hadn't said, and that this was the moment they needed to be said. "Tell me," she said quietly. "Not an accusation, an instruction." Ronan sat down. "Crane lost a boundary dispute in '71, he said. In Cascade County, he was on the other side of it that time he had the valid claim, and a land speculator was trying to take his eastern pasture. He won the case. Pause. The speculator's barn burned down 2 weeks after the ruling. The speculator moved to Oregon the following spring. Ronan looked at his hands. Nobody proved anything. Nobody tried very hard to prove anything." The statement settled into the room. "He burns things," Clara said. "When he can't get what he wants through paperwork," Ronan said. She looked around the cabin, the walls, the shelves, the fire in the hearth, the tin box under the bed with the original documents, Eli on the floor with his wooden spoon, and felt the specific, newly sharpened fear of a woman who has made a home out of something and is now calculating what it would take to lose it. But she did not let the fear run. She caught it and converted it. "Then we prepare for that," she said. "The documents move tonight. I'll take the originals to Walt Elkins. Crane doesn't know about Walt's place, and it's far enough off the main trail that a casual search wouldn't find it. You keep the certified copies here. If the cabin burns, we still have everything we need for the federal case." She met Ron's eyes. "And you tell me where every fire risk on this property is and how fast it spreads under what conditions, because if we know the pattern, we can know where to watch." Ronan stared at her for a moment. "You are," he said. in the tone of a man choosing words carefully, the most methodically fearless person I have ever met. "I'm not fearless," she said. "I'm just faster at turning fear into plans than most people." "That might be better than fearless. It's certainly more useful," she said. She rode to Walt Elkins's place that evening. Ronan had wanted to go with her, and she had pointed out with the logic that had won most of their disagreements that leaving the cabin empty while she was away was precisely the wrong approach. She took Eli because she was not going to leave her son in a cabin that might be a target, and she took the documents in a waterproof oilskin pouch inside her coat, and she rode the back trail that Ronan had shown her in better weather. Walt opened his door before she knocked, which meant he'd heard her coming, and had been watching since before she reached the yard. "You don't surprise easy," she said. "I used to," he said. Stopped after the third time, it almost killed me. He stepped back to let her in. "Something's happening. Several things are happening," she said. She handed him the oilskin pouch. "I need these to not exist at my property for a while." He took the pouch without asking what was in it, which told her everything she needed to know about Walt Elkins's understanding of the situation. "You know Crane burned a man's barn in '71, he said. "I know it now," she said. "Ronan told me tonight." Walt looked at her steadily. "There's a thing I know that Ronan doesn't," he said. "I've been trying to decide whether to tell him." Clara waited. "Crane has a man in the county sheriff's office," Walt said. "Not the sheriff himself, deputy, named Rourke. Young man, ambitious, not enough salary and too much debt. Crane's been paying his debt installments for 2 years. Rourke's not a bad man by nature, just a man who made a mistake and then made a bigger one trying to fix it." He picked up his coffee cup. "If Crane decides to do something to your property and it needs to look like it was investigated properly, Rourke is the man who investigates it." Clara sat with this for a moment. "How do you know about Rourke?" she asked. "Rourke's my wife's nephew," Walt said. "She's been dead 12 years, but the family connection didn't go away. He came to me last fall, said he wanted out of the arrangement but didn't know how to extract himself without Crane making his debt public and destroying his career." Walt's voice was dry and tired. "I told him to be patient and an opportunity might present itself." "The federal case," Clara said slowly. "A deputy who comes forward voluntarily to corroborate a federal fraud case, who provides documented evidence of corrupt county involvement, gets considerable consideration from a U.S. Marshal," Walt said. "He's been sitting on it, trying to decide if he trusts the federal process enough to use it." Clara's mind was moving fast, putting pieces into new arrangements. Rourke, a documented corrupt connection between Crane and the county sheriff's office. Voluntarily disclosed to the federal case. That wasn't just supporting evidence, that was the linchpin. That was the piece that elevated the land fraud from a civil matter to criminal conspiracy. "I need to speak with Rourke," she said. "I thought you might say that," Walt said. "Soon," she said, "before Crane moves. Before he has any reason to either activate Rourke for his purposes or warn him to stay quiet." "How soon?" Walt nodded slowly. "I'll get word to him." She rode back in the dark, which she did not love. But the trail was clear, and the moon was adequate, and she knew the route well enough by now that her body made the navigation decisions while her mind worked on the Rourke problem from every angle she could reach. When she came into the yard, Ronan was outside. He was not pacing. He was standing, which was more telling. A man who stood at the edge of his own yard in the dark, waiting for his wife to come home from an errand that should have taken an hour, but had taken nearly 3, was a man who had been doing a great deal of very quiet worrying. "I'm fine," she said before she was fully dismounted. "I know you're fine," he said. "I can see that." He took the horse's reins. "What kept you?" She told him about Rourke while they walked the horse to the lean-to together, and she watched the information hit him in stages, first the piece about the corrupt deputy, then the piece about Walt knowing for months, then the piece about what a voluntary federal disclosure could do to the case. His face went through several things quickly, and then settled into that compressed stillness that meant he was thinking hard and fast. "You arranged a meeting," he said. "In 2 days." "Yes." "Without asking me." She stopped and turned to face him. "Yes," she said again evenly. "Because Walt needed an answer immediately, and I knew what the right answer was." "Was I wrong?" "No," he said. "Then why does your face look like that?" He looked at her. Something in his expression broke open in a way she hadn't seen before, not anger, not frustration, but something rawer and harder to name. "Because you were on that road in the dark," he said, "with our son. And I was standing in this yard not knowing what was happening. He stopped." His jaw worked. "I am not accustomed to caring this much about where someone is." The air between them changed. It changed the way it had been changing incrementally since December, since the first morning and the coffee and the ledger and the sage in the tin cup. But this time it changed all at once, and there was no gradual adjustment available. There was only what he had just said, and the fact that it was said plainly. And they were standing in the dark, with the horse between them and Eli asleep against her chest and the bitter roots, pressing down silent and enormous above everything. She said softly. "I know," she said again. "I feel it too, but not yet. Not tonight. There's too much happening and I need to be able to think clearly, and I can't do that. She stopped. Said it properly. "I need us to finish this first." Before anything else, he looked at her for a long time. "All right," he said. Quiet and honest and entirely without resentment. "All right," she said. They went inside. The meeting with Rourke happened on the fourth day, not the second. Walt needed the extra time to persuade his wife's nephew that this was the moment. And persuading a man to put himself at the center of a federal case against someone who had leverage over his career required more than urgency, it required trust. And trust between Walt and Rourke was a fragile thing built over years of Walt, not judging a choice that deserved to be judged. The four of them, Walt, Rourke, Ronan, and Clara, sat around Walt's table with the door barred and the fire low. Rourke was younger than Clara had expected, mid-20s, with an honest face that was currently doing the specific work of a man who has made a decision he knows is right, and is terrified of it anyway. Clara had brought the ledger of documented evidence, the Helena Business Registry information, the survey stake documentation, the history of the 3 prior land fraud cases, and she spread it on the table in front of Rourke and let him read without interrupting. When he finished, he looked up. "If I do this," he said, "Crane will know it was me." "Crane will be facing a federal fraud indictment," Clara said. "His ability to harm you will be substantially limited." "Substantially limited isn't gone." "No," she said. "It's not." She did not soften it because he didn't need softening. He needed honesty. "But Deputy, let me ask you something. How long have you been living with this?" Rourke looked at the table. 2 years, he said. 2 years of knowing that every time Crane needs county cover, you provide it. 2 years of knowing that the badge you're wearing is being used for something other than what it was issued for." She kept her voice level. "I know what it costs to carry something like that. I carried things I shouldn't have carried for 2 years myself." She waited until he looked up. "The weight doesn't get lighter. It only gets more impossible to put down the longer you wait." Rourke was quiet. "I'm not going to tell you this is without risk," she said. "I will tell you that we are building the most complete federal fraud case this territory has seen in years. And a voluntary cooperating witness who provides documented evidence of county-level corruption is the difference between a civil land case and criminal conspiracy charges. What you know and what you can prove could end this. Permanently, for everyone Crane has done this to." Rourke looked at Ronan, who had been silent throughout, which Clara had asked him to be, because she had read Rourke correctly as a man who needed to feel he was making this choice himself, not being pushed into it. "She's telling you true," Ronan said simply. Rourke sat back, turned his coffee cup in both hands, looked at the evidence spread on the table. "I have records," he said finally. "My own records. I've been keeping them since the beginning, because even when I was doing what Crane wanted, I needed it documented somewhere. In case something happened to me." He looked at Clara. "Transactions, dates, instructions in writing." Clara went very still. "You have written documentation of Crane's instructions to you," she said carefully.
"Yes."
"In your own hand with dates."
"Yes."
"Deputy Rourke," she said. And her voice was steady and precise, and she was extremely grateful for her father, the school teacher, and the accounting books, and everything that had trained her to keep her voice steady when the inside of her chest was doing something that felt like the moment Eli took his first 3 steps. You just changed everything. 3 days later, Deputy Marshal Leonard Cade arrived in Harlan County. He did not arrive quietly. He arrived with 2 other deputies and the official documentation of a federal fraud investigation. And he went first to the sheriff's office, which was the correct procedural move and also the move that told Crane's people immediately that the federal process was past the point of informal resolution. Clara and Ronan heard about Cade's arrival from a rider who came up the mountain trail mid-morning, not a threatening rider, a young man from town who had done errands for Ronan before and whom Ronan trusted enough to receive information from. The marshal in town, the young man said, breathless from the elevation. At the land office first, then the sheriff's, took a stack of papers in with him. The sheriff looked like he'd been hit with a board. Anyone else show up? Ronan asked. A lawyer from Helena came on the same stage. Lot of luggage. The young man looked at Clara. And ma'am, I was told to tell you that a man named Garrett sends his regards and says the additional documentation arrived in time. The additional documentation. Rorke's records. Walt had ridden to Helena with them 2 days prior, and apparently they had made it to Garrett and from Garrett to Cade before the marshal left for Harlan County. Thank you, Clara said. Get yourself something to eat before you ride back. The young man went to find something to eat, and Clara looked at Ronan. And for a moment neither of them said anything, because the thing that was happening was large enough that ordinary words felt insufficient for it. It's moving, Ronan said. It's moving, she confirmed. And then the sound they had both been afraid of and prepared for, and hoping to avoid happened, hooves on the trail. Not one horse, several, coming up fast and not trying to be quiet about it. Ronan moved to the door and Clara moved to the rifle, the Winchester with the stiff safety, and she pushed it hard to the right the way he'd told her, and it came off clean. And she was beside him at the door when he opened it, not behind him, not hidden, beside him. Hollis Crane sat on a gray horse in the yard, and he was not a man who looked like the villain in a story. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, and he had the easy, settled manner of someone who has had money long enough to forget it's supposed to be earned. Beside him were 3 riders, none of whom was Pruitt, all of whom had the flat-eyed competence of men hired specifically for situations like this one. Crane looked at Ronan, then he looked at Clara and the rifle, and something moved through his expression, not fear, but recalculation. The fast, experienced recalculation of a man who has walked into rooms before where the geography was different than he expected. Blackridge, conversational, almost friendly. It didn't have to be this. I want you to know that. I made a fair offer more than once. You sent men to move my boundary markers, Ronan said. And threatened my wife. That was a misunderstanding. You hired a lawyer to file a fraudulent survey claim using a shell company that you've used to steal land from 3 other families in 2 other counties, Clara said. Crane looked at her. His expression had the particular quality of a man encountering a woman who knows more than he prepared for. Mrs. Blackridge, he said, this is a conversation between men. No, Clara said. It's a conversation between you and the people whose land you're trying to steal. I'm one of those people. She kept the rifle across her body, not aimed, not threatening, but present and unambiguous. The U.S. Marshal is in Harlan County right now. He has the federal fraud petition, the documented history of your 3 prior operations, and the voluntary testimony of a county deputy who has kept records of your instructions to him for 2 years. She watched Crane's face go through something she had not seen there before. Whatever you came up here to threaten us with, the window for it to accomplish anything useful to you closed this morning. The silence in the yard was the specific silence of a man recalculating very fast and not finding an answer. One of the riders shifted in his saddle. Ronan looked at him. Just looked. The rider went still. Crane looked at his hands on his reins. He looked at the cabin. He looked at Clara with an expression that had moved through its various stages and arrived somewhere she recognized. The expression of a man who has run out of road and knows it. The railroad money, he started, is not going to be paid to you, Clara said quietly. Because you don't own the land and you're not going to own it. And when the federal case is adjudicated, the 3 families you took land from in Cascade and Lewis and Clark County are going to be notified that there is a legal mechanism available to them to challenge those takings. She looked at him steadily. It's over, Mr. Crane. Not because we beat you. Because you built something that only worked when nobody was paying attention, and people are paying attention now. Crane sat on his horse for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. That was the thing about men like Crane, they were intelligent, strategic, capable of long planning. The intelligence that had built this scheme recognized, in this moment, the same thing that intelligence always recognized when the game was genuinely lost, the cost of continuing versus the cost of stopping. "I'll need to speak with my lawyer," he said finally. "Your lawyer is going to tell you to cooperate with the marshal," Clara said. "That's my advice, and I'm giving it to you free, which is more courtesy than you've shown anyone on this mountain." Crane looked at her one more time, then at Ronan, then he turned his horse. His riders turned with him. They rode out of the yard and down the trail and didn't look back, and Clara stood at the door with the rifle and watched them go until she couldn't hear the hooves anymore, and then for another full minute, because Ronan had taught her that. When she finally lowered the rifle, her hands were shaking. Not from fear. She identified it precisely and quickly, the way she identified everything. Adrenaline, the body's honest account of what it had just done. The shaking was not weakness, it was aftermath. Ronan put his hand over hers on the rifle. He didn't say anything. He just held her hand steady until the shaking stopped, which took about 30 seconds, and then he let go and she breathed, and they both stood at the open door looking at the empty yard. "He'll cooperate," she said. "Yes," Ronan said. "It'll still be months before the federal case resolves." "Yes, and the 3 families in Cascade and Lewis and Clark County." "We'll write to Garrett today," Ronan said. "He'll know the right way to reach them." Clara nodded. She set the rifle against the wall inside the door and turned around, and Eli was sitting on the floor in the middle of the cabin, looking at her with enormous, solemn eyes. Having apparently observed the entire proceedings from this position with total composure. "You're very calm," she told him. He held up his wooden spoon. She laughed. The laugh came out a little ragged, a little too close to something else, but it was real, and it moved through her like weather, moving through and leaving the air cleaner behind it. Ronan came in and closed the door, and stood in the middle of the cabin and looked at her. "You knew he'd come today," he said. "It was not quite a question." "I thought he would," she said. "A man like Crane, when the legal structure moves against him, needs to try one direct approach first. To see if the people in his way are actually as serious as the paperwork suggests." She sat down at the table and let her body exhale the last of the tension. "We're serious, he knows that now." "Yes," she looked up at Ronan. "We did that together. You know that. What I said out there only landed because you were standing beside me." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "What you said out there landed because it was true," he said. "I was just the evidence." She looked back at him, and for a moment the cabin was very still. The fire, the mountain outside, Eli with his wooden spoon, and 2 people who had built something neither of them had names for yet. Something that had been built in the specific crucible of a winter that tried to take everything and hadn't managed it. "Ronan," she said. "I know," he said. "I said not yet." "I remember. But soon," she said. His expression did what it did when he was restraining something, not unhappy, not impatient. Patient in the way the mountains were patient, which was the absolute patience of something that had no doubt about the outcome and no need to rush toward it. "I'll be here," he said simply. She nodded. He went to put the horse up, because there was still always work to do, and Clara turned to the table and pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to the projection page and began updating the numbers, because that was also always work to do. And because she had learned over this long particular winter that the best way to hold on to what you'd built was to keep working on it. Outside, the mountains held steady in the February cold. Inside, the fire burned, and a woman who had once been lot 17 in a trading post auction did the accounting for a life that was finally, unmistakably her own. The federal case against Hollis Crane and Bitter Root Land and Mining was formally adjudicated on the 14th of April, 1875. Clara knew the date before the official letter arrived because Garrett had sent a preliminary wire to the Harlan County Telegraph Office, and the young man who ran errands up the mountain brought it to her on a Tuesday morning while Ronan was out checking the trap line. She read it standing in the yard with Eli on her hip, and she read it twice to make sure she was reading it correctly. And then she sat down on the step outside the cabin door and held her son and breathed. Crane had cooperated as she had predicted he would. His lawyer had been thorough about the negotiation. Crane was a man who calculated costs before he paid them, and the cost of a full federal fraud trial versus the cost of cooperation had resolved itself into the inevitable answer. He had provided documentation of the shell company structure, of the payments to Rourke, of the lawyer who had run the survey fraud in all 3 counties. He had named Gerald Foss as the architect of the legal mechanism and positioned himself as a client rather than the principal designer. Which was probably not entirely true, but was close enough to true that the federal prosecutors had accepted it in exchange for a full confession and financial restitution. The restitution was the part that had made Clara sit down. The 3 families in Cascade County and Lewis and Clark County, whose land had been taken through the same mechanism, were to receive full compensation for their documented losses. The amounts were not small. They were in fact the kind of numbers that changed the shape of a life. And Ronan's land patent was formally confirmed undisputed, with a federal injunction against any future survey challenges. 60 acres of North Bitterroot Ridge, marked by 3 stone cairns that Clara had helped rebuild in the January cold, now existed in federal record as incontestably his. Theirs. She was still sitting on the step when she heard his horse on the trail, and she stayed where she was because she wanted to see his face when she told him. Ronan came into the yard and read her expression before she said a word. He dismounted in one movement and covered the distance between them quickly, for a man who usually moved at a considered pace. "Tell me," he said. She held up the wire. He took it. "Read it." The silence while he read was the specific silence she had catalogued across 4 months of living beside this man, and she could track what he was feeling by the particular quality of it. This one was unfamiliar. She had not heard this one before. When he looked up, she understood why. She had never seen Ronan Blackridge look undone before. Not frightened, not grief-stricken, nothing that simple. Just undone, like a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. "The land's clear," he said. "The land is clear," she confirmed. "And the 3 families, I read it." His voice was rough. He looked at the wire again, then at her. "The families get their restitution." "Yes." He sat down on the step beside her, right beside her, their shoulders touching, which was more contact than they usually allowed in the yard in daylight, in the territory of ordinary daytime. Eli, who was sitting between them, looked at Ronan with great seriousness, and then offered him the wooden spoon, which was still Eli's highest form of welcome, and had been since January. Ronan took the spoon. He looked at it for a moment, and then he laughed, and this time the laugh was nothing like the door-opening sound of early December. This was different, fuller, like a man who has remembered what it sounds like when things are genuinely all right. "Thank you," he said to Eli very seriously. Eli retrieved the spoon and immediately gnawed on the handle, satisfied. They sat on the step together in the April morning, the mountain finally beginning its spring thaw around them, and Clara felt the winter all of it. The whole long season of fear and evidence and careful building and holding things steady begin to loosen its grip. "There's something I need to do today," she said. "I know," Ronan said. She looked at him. "What do you think you know?" "I think you're going to write to the 3 families." She blinked. "Yes, and to Walt, and to Garrett." He paused. "And to Rourke." She nodded slowly. Rourke had provided his documentation voluntarily and had resigned his deputy position at the sheriff's office before the federal proceedings concluded. The marshal's office had given him the consideration Garrett had promised, no charges filed, a record of voluntary cooperation noted formally. He had moved to Missoula with whatever was left of his debt paid down by the confession process. Clara had thought about him more than once in the months since, about the particular courage it took to put down a thing you'd been carrying wrong for 2 years, knowing the people watching might not understand the weight of it. She understood the weight of it. "I'll write the letters this afternoon," she said. "But first I want to walk the North Ridge." Ronan looked at her sideways. "The North Ridge. I want to see the cairns," she said simply. "I want to walk the whole eastern boundary and look at what's ours." He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and held out his hand. She took it, and they walked, the three of them, up through the spring morning toward the north ridge that had started all of it, the survey stake and the scattered stones and the letter to Helena and the long, specific work of fighting for something worth keeping. The cairns were exactly as they had rebuilt them. Clara stood at the northeastern corner and put her hand on the top stone, and Ronan stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was one of the things she had come to love most about being beside this man. The silences had weight but not pressure. They didn't demand filling. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." When Crane came to the yard in February, she said I told him the window for his threats had closed. That it was over. She looked at the cairn. "But there's a window that hasn't closed. That I've been keeping open." She felt him go very still beside her. "Ronan," she turned to face him. The April light was full on his face, and she had memorized that face over 4 months in the particular way you memorize the face of someone you have decided to trust, feature by feature, moment by moment, until the trust is so complete it stops feeling like a decision and starts feeling like a fact. "You said in December that if I ever chose you, you would be a father to my son and a husband to me." She held his gaze. "I'm choosing you." He looked at her, not with surprise, with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and has just watched it arrive and is taking a moment to verify that it is actually real and not the thing he has trained himself not to expect, because expecting it hurt too much. "You're sure," he said. "Not a question. A check. The kind of check a man does when something matters enough that he refuses to assume." "I have been sure," she said, "for longer than I was ready to say it." He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face, and she leaned into it, and Eli, sitting on Ronan's other arm, completely unconcerned with the gravity of the moment, grabbed a handful of Ronan's coat and pulled, which was also a kind of endorsement. "Yes," Ronan said to her and to the boy and to the mountain, and to whatever version of his future self had spent 14 years believing this particular kind of thing was behind him. Yes, they stood on the north ridge in the April cold with the bitterroots running white and huge in every direction, and it was not a dramatic moment in the way that dramatic moments are supposed to look. There were no witnesses. There was no ceremony. There was only the solid, quiet fact of two people choosing each other on the land they had fought to keep, with a baby who had been through everything with them and had opinions about coat buttons and wooden spoons and was currently attempting to eat a piece of Ronan's collar. It was, Clara thought, exactly right. The wedding was in May, when the trails were clear enough for Walt Elkins to ride down, and the circuit preacher happened through Harlan County for the first time in 4 months. It was held in the cabin because Clara wanted it in the cabin, not in the town church, not on the steps of the courthouse, not in any of the places where the story had been harder. In the place where the story had been good. Walt stood up for Ronan. Clara had written to her eldest brother in Wisconsin, knowing the letter would arrive too late for him to travel but wanting him to know. She dressed in the best dress she had, which was not the dress she had worn in the trading post in December, but a different one that Ronan had brought back from town one afternoon without explanation, leaving it folded on the table and going back out to work with the specific manner of a man who was not going to discuss what he had just done but had done it deliberately. She had put the dress on and looked at it for a long time. Then she had gone outside and found him splitting wood and said, "It fits." He had kept splitting wood. "Good, you guessed the size." "I'm good at estimating dimensions," he said, and there was something in his voice that was trying very hard not to be a smile. "You bought me a dress," she said. "I noticed you were making do with 2, he said. "The circuit preacher's coming in May." She had stood behind him for a moment. Then she had said, "Ronan Blackridge, you are the least romantic man I have ever met," and gone back inside before he could see that she was smiling in a way she couldn't control. He had laughed. She heard it from inside the cabin. The full one, the real one. The preacher was a cheerful man named Collins, who had performed marriages in trading posts and barns, and once, he told them, on a moving raft on the Missouri River, so a cabin in the Bitterroots was entirely within his comfort zone. He said the words with genuine feeling, and Ronan said his plainly and steadily, and Clara said hers clearly and without hesitation. And when Collins said, "You may kiss your bride," Ronan looked at her with that expression she had catalogued and named and loved, the one that said more than he would put into words. And then he kissed her briefly and properly in front of Walt and Collins and Eli, who observed the entire proceeding from Ronan's arm with the dignified composure of a child who takes ceremony seriously. Afterward, Walt produced a bottle of whiskey that he had clearly been saving for something, and poured 3 glasses, none for Ronan, who accepted this without comment and said, "To the Blackridges," and drank. Clara held her glass and looked at Ronan, who was looking at her, and she thought, "I was lot 17. She thought it not with bitterness but with the specific clarity of someone who needs to remember where a road started in order to fully understand where it has gone. She had been a number pinned to a coat in a cold trading post, and the man beside her had walked in out of the winter and said, "I'm taking a family home." And the word had landed in her chest, like something she hadn't known she was missing until it arrived. She had built the home herself, alongside him, board by board, account by account, evidence by evidence, choice by choice. She drank the toast. "To the Blackridges," she said. The summer came in properly by June, and the mountain transformed itself the way it did every year without apology, white to green to gold, the trapline quiet in the warm months. The cabin no longer just warmth against cold but a different kind of shelter, the shelter of sufficiency and peace. Ronan worked the land, and Clara worked the books, and Eli worked on walking with the single-minded dedication of who has discovered locomotion and intends to use it on everything. Letters arrived through the summer. Garrett wrote that the federal case had been formally closed and the restitution disbursements completed. One family in Cascade County had written to the marshal's office to ask who had started the investigation, and Kate had told them. And Clara received a letter from a woman named Mary Aldridge in Cascade County that she's read twice and then kept in the ledger between the projection pages. "We had given up," Mary Aldridge had written. "We thought the land was simply gone. My husband could not speak about it without forgive me. I don't have the words for what it did to him. What you did for our family is something I cannot repay and do not have language for. Please know that we are home." Clara read that last line many times. Please know that we are home. She knew what that meant. She knew exactly what that meant. Deputy Rourke wrote once, from Missoula, a short letter that said he had found work with a freight company and was doing well and that he was grateful. And that was all, which was the right amount. Walt came to supper once a month and argued with Ronan about trapline strategy and taught Eli, who was walking properly now and into everything, to identify the different kinds of clouds, which Eli took to with immense seriousness and practiced constantly by pointing at the sky and making sounds that were not yet words but had the clear conviction of words. In July, Clara found herself sitting at the table in the evening after Eli was asleep, the ledger open in front of her, running the numbers for the season. The North Ridge trapline was performing exactly as she had projected when she rebuilt the accounting system. The operation was profitable in a way it had never been before, not wealthy, not anything like the railroad money Crane had been pursuing, but solid. Sufficient, capable of sustaining itself and growing slowly in the way that real things grow. Ronan came and sat across from her, as he had every evening since December, and she showed him the numbers. He looked at the projection page. He had gotten much better at reading it. Next season, he said, we could add a southern line if we extended the lease on Walt's southern acreage. Yes, she said. I already priced it, it's here, she pointed. He looked at where she was pointing. Looked up at her. You priced it before I mentioned it. I priced it 3 weeks ago, she said. I was waiting to see if you'd arrive at the same conclusion on your own. And if I hadn't, then I would have shown you the numbers and let the numbers do the arguing. He looked at her with the expression she had decided, somewhere around February, was her favorite expression in the entire world, the one that said he found her simultaneously exasperating and extraordinary and had no intention of having it any other way. You could just tell me things, he said. Where's the interest in that, she said. He laughed. She loved that laugh. She loved that she had watched it come back from wherever it had been since Anna died in the winter of 1868. Had watched it return incrementally through the dark months and the difficult ones. had heard it become more frequent and more natural and less rusty until it was simply the sound of this man being genuinely happy, which was not a sound she took for granted and did not intend to. They talked through the southern lease numbers until the fire was low, and then Ronan went to check on Eli, as he did every night, and Clara sat at the table for a moment alone. She thought about December. She could do that now without the tight, breathless quality that the memory had carried through the hard months. She could think about the trading post and the grease pencil number and the auction and Ronan walking in out of the cold. And the memory was still sharp, but it was no longer the shape of a wound. It was the shape of a beginning. She had been a woman who had lost everything. She had become something she had not had language for when the process started, and still did not have perfect language for. Because the English language was not fully equipped for women who had been broken and had chosen to put themselves back together in a different configuration, then they started in stronger in the broken places, as the saying went, but also different in the places that had never been broken before, the places that were new. She was new in ways she was still discovering. Ronan came back from checking on Eli and stood in the middle of the cabin, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the fire was low and the mountain was quiet outside, and Eli was asleep making the small, certain sounds of a child who has never once doubted that the people around him will keep him safe. He said something today, Ronan said, when I put him down. He said something. Ronan stopped. His voice had done something. He cleared it. Da. The word landed in the cabin the way the pouch of gold had landed on the trading post table, in December sudden final, changing the shape of everything in the room. Clara stood up. She looked at Ronan's face, at what was moving through it. At the thing that had no name but that she had watched accumulate since the evening in January when Eli took 3 steps, and Ronan had made the sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. Da, she said. He confirmed. His voice was not quite steady. She crossed the cabin and put her arms around him, which she had done before but not like this, not with the specific weight and purpose of a woman holding someone who needed to be held. And he put his arms around her, and they stood in the middle of the floor of the cabin that had been his and was now theirs, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was not already being said by the fact of them standing there. After a moment he said into her hair, I didn't know it would be this. What did you think it would be? I didn't let myself think about it, he said. After on I made a decision not to plan for anything like this. And then you walked into a trading post, Ember, she said. I walked into a trading post in December, he agreed. And you were lot 17, and you were the most alarming man I had ever seen in my life. Was I? You were enormous, and you had gold and legal papers, and you walked in like you owned the room, she said. And then you looked at all those men like you were personally disappointed in every decision they had ever made. He was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. That was when I started paying attention. She felt him exhale, a long, slow exhale, the kind that carries something out with it. I'm glad you paid attention. So am I, she said. She stepped back and looked at him, and he looked at her. And in the morning they would write to Garrett about the southern lease, and check the North Ridge cairns and update the ledger projections. And Eli would wake up demanding the wooden spoon, and the world would continue to require all the things the world required. But tonight the cabin was warm and the child was asleep, and the land outside was theirs legally, permanently. Conclusively theirs, and the man in front of her had walked through a door in December with a pouch of gold, and changed the trajectory of a life that had been headed somewhere dark, and she had changed his and that was the whole of it, simple and enormous at once. She reached up and put her palm flat against his jaw, the scar she had traced in her mind 100 times before she ever touched it. Ronan, she said, he said, and that was enough. That was all of it. 2 people on a mountain in the territory of Montana, in the spring of 1875, with a child asleep in the next room who had learned the word da and said it to the right man, and a ledger on the table with the numbers finally adding up correctly, and a future that belonged to no one but them. In a cold trading post in December, they had given her a number and called it her identity. She had taken a different one, the name she chose freely. for the life she built from everything they tried to take from her. Clara Blackridge. And in the Bitterroot Mountains, in the hard and honest country of the American frontier, that name chosen, earned, and kept was the only document that had ever mattered.